So in a certain sense, you can see this real tendency to kind of embrace some ideas of market reform and liberalization, trying to improve the banks. But as I go through in the book, when you look at the actual details, there was never any inclination to give up any sort of controls.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy Leutert. I am an associate professor and the GLP Mingzi Mei Chair of Chinese Economics and Trade at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies. And I am delighted to be joined today by Nick Borst to discuss his recent book, The Bird in the Cage, China's Economic Contradictions. Nick is the Vice President and Director of China Research at Seafair Capital Partners. Full biographies for both of us are available on the National Committee's website, but I want to note that Nick and I are both fellows in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program, PIP. So let me jump right in. Nick, can you tell us a bit more about what motivates you to write this book?
Well, thanks, Wendy, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this book discussion, and especially with you because you're an expert on so many of these topics. What really motivated this book was this really profound sense of whiplash that we've seen in the coverage of the Chinese economy here in the US. This very intense feeling that China had changed its economic trajectory under Xi Jinping, that China was now pursuing a more statist, party-controlled economic structure than it had in the past, and that China had abandoned many of the reforms that Deng and others early in China's reform era had pursued. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of that, go on my own intellectual journey to really understand how much have we seen actual change with China's economic policies, and how much of that is really just driven by maybe seeing China with rose-colored glasses, ascribing hopes to what we wanted China to be rather than what it actually was. And so for me, it was a very kind of illuminating process to kind of go through the history of China's economic reforms, to actually try to look at what party leaders were saying they wanted for China, they wanted for Chinese economic policy, and then analyze how that was actually implemented in reality. And going through that process, to me, it became clear two things. One, there actually is quite a bit of continuity between what we're seeing currently with Chinese economic policy and what leaders all the way back to Deng Xiaoping have been saying. But there are also some important differences, and I think we'll have a chance to get into those. And so analyzing, really understanding the continuity, but also the differences, I think helps better situate where we are in the current moment with China.
Let me ask a follow-up question about the title of your book, The Bird in the Cage, China's Economic Contradictions. Can you explain for listeners who might be unfamiliar, what's the history and the meaning of this metaphor, the bird in the cage? And why do you personally think that this is a helpful metaphor for us to understand China's economy?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny metaphor, but I think it's one that's really instructive for understanding the Chinese economy. And so it's attributed back to Chen Yun, who was one of China's earliest and most important reformers in the 1970s and 1980s. And the context of when Chen said this was early in China's reform period. They were starting with all sorts of experiments, allowing markets to develop across the country. And what Chen relayed this to was the the economy, and especially economic liberalization and reforms, needed space to grow. There had to be scope for these experiments. Chen makes a comment, you can't hold the bird too tightly or you'll crush it. But at the same time, that there had to be this framework of government and party control around the economy that could never be abandoned. And so in the context of when Chen is making this statement, it's really around the apparatus of central planning that existed in China still at that point. And that's changed over time, and the private sector plays a larger role. There's more market forces in China. But overall, that framework, I think, is still very relevant to understanding current day Chinese economic policy of post Mao, post the economic disasters of the Great Leap Forward and other kind of Maoist policies. a real understanding and embrace of the need for economic reform in China to utilize the tools of the market to drive productivity, to grow the Chinese economy, but also this sort of deep inherent skepticism. These are important tools, but they're also dangerous, and we can't let them, escape our grasp. That we, as the Communist Party, still have to have the ability to guide, shape the economy, to channel the productive forces of the economy towards our priorities and to be able to intervene how and when we see necessary. And so that's the concept of the bird in the cage, the bird being the economy and economic reform needs to have space and room to grow, but that the party is always going to maintain this cage of control around the economy and never let it escape its grasp. And so that dynamic, I think, really explains the history of Chinese economic reform from the 1970s up until today. That we see these ebbs and flows, periods where the cage is bigger, periods where it's shrunk. And that dynamic, that tension of basically wanting to use the market, but also wanting to control it, I think is very important.
So you start the book by providing an extremely clear and insightful analysis of China's initial reform period from the late 1970s through the 2000s, which you contrast with the earlier planned economy period under Mao. And one of the things that stuck out for me is that you highlight, despite these important differences between China's successive leaders throughout this period, they did have a common goal of harnessing market forces without relinquishing state control. So similar to the metaphor of the birding cage that you just talked about. I wonder if you could give us an example from the book about, specifically how did China's leaders seek to achieve that during this initial reform period?
Yeah, I think there's a couple really good examples of this. One very famous is just the special economic zones themselves, where China has designated key areas in coastal cities where economic reforms were allowed to occur, that there were more experiments with, inviting in foreign investment, more market-based labor contracts, but at the same time trying to geographically contain it, basically so it couldn't spread beyond the party's control throughout the rest of the economy. There's also sort of the very kind of controlled and staged sequencing of price liberalization in China that I think is a good example of that. But to take it to, I think, a little bit more recent example, and one that I think is important because it's present through to today, is just the banking system reforms. And so I think many viewers will be familiar that the banking cleanup that China underwent in the late 1990s, where the banking sector was just a disaster. They had so many bad loans to state-owned enterprises. If you crunch the numbers, all the big banks were technically insolvent. They had losses that were going to wipe out their entire capital bases. And so the party did embrace real reform and restructuring of the banks. And there was a huge banking sector cleanup, restructuring of the banks. They brought in foreign, basically Western banks to invest in the state-owned banks and help restructure them. And they actually went to the step of partially privatizing these banks by listing them on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So in a certain sense, you can see this real tendency to kind of embrace some ideas of market reform and liberalization, trying to improve the banks. But as I go through in the book, when you look at the actual details, there was never any inclination to give up any sort of control. So in terms of ownership levels, in terms of who is appointing the key leadership at the banks, the continued operation of party committees within these banks, and the fact that you can just read the annual reports of these banks, and they're still talking about all these sort of government priorities that they're supporting with lending. To me, it's very clear that even though China embraced aspects of reform and market orientation for the banks, it never intended to give up control of them. And that has persisted even to today, 2025, still all of the large banks in China are state-owned and state-controlled. And so I think that's a very sort of representative example of the party understands the power of economic reform, the productive power of markets, but has taken these very clear, concrete steps to make sure that it can still retain control over what it views as the key parts of the economy, with banking being a big one of those.
So if we move to China today under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who came to
Mm.
power in 2012, what do you think is similar in Xi's handling of the economy compared to his predecessors?
Yeah, and this is a kind of a long-running debate in the China watching community in the U.S. of, and I think you coined a very good phrase, deepening, not departure. So I'll piggyback on that a little bit. She, from my research, in many important ways, especially ideologically, represents a lot of continuity with his predecessors. Where if you read his early statements, or even if you read some of the early policy proposals, most notably the Third Plenum, which was released in 2013, you can very much see this partial embrace of reform and markets in his policy. So um, there's a lot of talk about incremental reforms around allowing the market to play a more decisive role in the allocation of resource. And I think, a lot of us, including myself, were a little bit guilty of over indexing on those parts of the policies and not really looking through the entire documents and saying, well, actually, there's still all this, all these sections about the importance of state-owned enterprises and efforts to reinforce and consolidate state-owned enterprises, and to have the to have the party continue to play a leading role in the economy and, have influence over private companies. And so I think in this sense, especially for the first part of Xi's administration of his reign, there's a lot of continuity in the sense that he really embraced the framework that we've been talking about of the importance of the private economy, the importance of market reforms. But at the same time, I don't think there's any evidence that he ever intended to sort of give up the key levers of state control. So a lot of continuity there. Events, I think, have pushed him in a different direction. But if you had to take a snapshot of, where he stood in 2013 or 2014 relative to his predecessors, I think there's a strong line of continuity there.
Mhm. In conversations about this issue, about the extent of continuity under Xi Jinping, and this concept of deepening, not departure, which I and others have written about, it was also raised to me, I think, an important point in conversation that at some point deepening does become departure. And at what point in this process are we moving to a different track? So
Mhm.
this seems to be an argument that you also make in the book. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about when and why Xi Jinping did begin to deviate from his predecessors' ideas and economic approaches. In the book, you talk about a number of different influential episodes, really a long list of differences, the interbank financing crunch, or rather drivers of this new trajectory, the interbank financing crunch, housing market downturn, currency turmoil, stock market volatility, particularly in 2015, private sector financing crunch, conglomerate crackdown, and a series of new financial regulations that you term in the book the regulatory windstorm. So, if you had to pick just one of these episodes as being the most important in shifting Xi's approach, which would you select and why?
Yeah, the list you put out there, I think, is just the sheer number, I think, illustrates how much basically early financial and economic volatility that the Xi administration ran into, where to go back to the prior answer, coming in with sort of a very typical approach for a new generation of leadership in China with, some new reforms, and basically a lot of those reforms blowing up in their face very early on. And so whether it's interbank turmoil, or I think especially in 2015, where you have the combination of a huge crash in the stock market, one that really sort of palpably affects a lot of mom and pop investors in China. People were out on the streets and upset about that. International currency volatility around devaluation of the currency that occurred at the same point. Really a long series of basically missteps that I think soured Xi on reform. And I think what we see sort of post 2015 is sort of a retrenchment that we've seen that pattern in other Chinese leaders, where sometimes reform gets a little too far ahead of where the party is comfortable with, or is producing these negative consequences, these unintended consequences, and there's a pullback and a period of retrenchment and restriction for a couple years where, you know, previously, scope and space that was given to the private economy is suddenly uh, restricted, and we see kind of more conservative policy making. I think that sequence of events is, we've seen it before. It happened with prior leadership. What is different, though, is that we haven't really seen the pivot back towards openness and growth that we would have expected. That if she had followed kind of the same pattern as his predecessors, we would have seen a couple years of restrictions, and then growth would suffer, and then we'd see a pivot back to more pro-growth policies. And to go back to the metaphor, the cage would start to grow again. Now, why hasn't she pivoted back? It's a key section of the book, and what the argument I make in that section is I think it is really driven by this competition with the US. So right around the time where we would expect that economic policy might be loosening up again and the party would be more favorable towards reform and experiments, this is really 2018, 2019, where the geostrategic competition with the US starts to get very, very intense. And suddenly Chinese leaders, the party itself, feels this very intense sense of insecurity about being in this very contentious competition with the US, with the US government that has all sorts of different tools that it can use to basically put pressure on China, whether it's sanctions or technology restrictions or tariffs or all these other tools. So when I try to answer why, in what ways is she different? Why isn't he sort of pivoted back to reform and opening like other Chinese leaders have done? I think it is really less a matter of ideology and much more the fact that China's geostrategic position has changed quite substantially. And Chinese leaders feel that they are in this very intense, long-running competition with a global superpower. And that has really made them much more risk averse in a lot of important ways. And
Mhm.
so that the same ability or willingness to sort of experiment and allow the economy to do new things and potentially create risks that are necessary for that that willingness to bear those risks has gone down substantially. And I think the party on a variety of different fronts is very focused on enforcing stability, uh, increasing its control over the economy, and ultimately kind of promoting self-reliance so that they're much less susceptible to this type of coercion from the United States.
So if we look more closely then at US-China relations, it seems in the book that during the early reform decades, China's leaders viewed economic interdependence and greater ties economically with the US as a source of opportunity. And now it seems very clear that Xi and Chinese leaders view it as instead a source of vulnerability and threat. And you write in the book that Xi has embraced a more interventionist role in the economy as a geostrategic imperative in order to prevail in strategic competition with the United States. Can you give us some examples on the China side of how she has tried to guide the economy toward these national security goals, and how successful do you think that these efforts have been?
Yeah, and I think as we discussed earlier, it sort of starts in 2018 to 2019, but then really accelerates rapidly in sort of the post-COVID era, where um, so much of what we can see that Chinese leaders are talking about and the thrust of the different policies is about basically this sense of economic insecurity that China has stemming from this competition with the United States. And so, as I mentioned before, there's this real reduction in the tolerance for any type of risk. There's also a renewed push to really have control over the commanding heights of the economy, key companies, key industries, key nodes of transmission within the economy. And where I think this is the most clear is in this kind of whole of nation self-reliance drive that we see right now. Um, this talk, and it even predates, Xi in some ways has been talking about this his entire tenure, but even more recently talking about these technological choke points that China needs to be able to develop its own domestic sources of technology so that it's not reliant on the US, that it's not reliant on US allies, that it's free from this potential risk that, through use of sanctions or other methods, that China could just basically be cut off from key and important sources of technology that its economy relies on. And so we see huge, huge efforts, hundreds of billions of dollars being spent to really push these self-reliance drives across a variety of different industries. One of the key focuses has been the semiconductor industry. And so we've had a whole series of, they call them the kind of big chip funds, where hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested through government guidance funds into companies that sort of kickstart China's own advanced semiconductor industry. Local governments are doing the same. And you just see this huge flurry of uh, not only capital and resources, but also policies designed to promote these industries, really focused on self-reliance and the sense that we have to break free from this potential control that the US and its allies have over our economy through this. Now, how successful has it been? I think it's a very mixed bag at this point. So, if you look at industries like electric vehicles, batteries, clean energy, it has been very, very amazing how quickly China has advanced in those industries, and in many respects has become a global leader, and not only is self-sufficient for those technologies, but actually exporting it to the rest of the world. And so I think that is quite amazing how they've been able to do that. But then there's been industries like, at least up until this point, semiconductors has been sort of a big failure where they've, despite having spent hundreds of billions of dollars, they have not caught up with the rest of the world and continue to rely on the US and US allies for advanced chips. And I would say one of the cost associated with this self-reliance drive is not just the money and the kind of potential waste in some of these industries, but also I think it has done a lot to worsen China's economic relations with the rest of the world, and that many of China's trading partners have seen these huge pushes to develop industries domestically that in a way ultimately leads to their companies being cut out of the Chinese market. And so there's this real trade-off where I think China has benefited so much from global integration, being part of the world trading system, but this push towards self-reliance has frankly put a lot of pressure on China's trading relations. And it's not just the US, but there's a variety of different countries right now that are really reevaluating their trading relationship with China.
So, moving toward the end of the book, you have this fascinating chapter where you talk about three different contradictions in China's economic policy. The first, growth versus stability, because policies that promote economic stability may constrain growth. The second is innovation versus control, because policies that promote party control might damage private sector innovation. And the third is global integration versus self-reliance, as you just talked about, because policies that promote economic self-reliance may lead to foreign economic restrictions against China. So if we think about all three of these contradictions together, it seems that China is currently prioritizing stability over growth and control over innovation and self-reliance over global integration, despite some of the trade-offs and costs involved that you just talked about. Would that be a fair characterization of your argument? And if this is the case, do you think that this alignment can be sustained in the long term?
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair characterization. And there's lots of things going on with the Chinese economy, but I think one of the root sources of why growth has slowed down and why it's weak right now is this overemphasis on these, let's essentially call them non-growth priorities of wanting to achieve almost excessive stability across the economy where you can't have bankruptcies and you can't have economic dislocation. Really a focus on we have to control every important and influential company in the economy, especially big private companies. And then the self-reliance drive that we talked about of this push across multiple different industries to basically do import substitution and not be reliant on the rest of the world. I will say, I think there has been a bit of a recalibration relative to where we were in sort of 2020, 2021, when China's big tech crackdown was going on. And, people were worried that all of these big private companies were essentially going to be wiped out by new regulations from Beijing. I think the impact on the Chinese economy was so disastrous from that there's been a bit of a recalibration and a little more space given to private companies to grow and expand. But from everything I can see, it's more of a tactical reset rather than a strategic change, and that the cage around the economy remains relatively tight, and that Xi and other top party leaders are very focused on this idea of we are in an intense competition with the United States, and we need an economy that is channeling resources towards making us stronger in that competition. We need private companies that are supporting these national priorities. We definitely don't need private companies that are creating problems or social instability. Those companies find themselves in Beijing's crosshairs very, very quickly. And it's not the path I would choose for China. I think it's one that leads to much slower growth. It leads to worse living standards for people living in China, especially a worse kind of trajectory for young people trying to find a job and have a good life and provide for their family. But it's one that I think if you're sitting in Beijing makes sense of if you really feel like you are in this long-term competition with the US that is potentially existential, that you need to reformat and structure your economy for that competition. And so I think that's where we sit, where it's always a little dangerous to pretend we know what Xi and other leaders are thinking. But I think if you ask them, they would say this is the most pragmatic choice for China given the context that we find ourselves in. And so in that sense, and what I argue in the book is that I think China is going to lean towards these priorities of stability, control, and self-reliance for basically as long as there's this strategic competition with the US and that there's this deterioration in relations. And I'm not an international relations expert, so I'll leave it to others to say if the US-China relationship is suddenly going to improve. I don't think it's very likely. I think there are some sort of structural factors that mean that even if competition is managed and peaceful, which I hope it is, that it's going to exist and persist for a while. And so in that sense, I think China is under Xi and in the current environment likely to veer towards these non-growth goals over time rather than pivoting back to a more reform and opening mindset.
So if we return to the metaphor of the bird in the cage where we started our conversation, do you think that the bird is ever going to be able to fly free in the next, say, 10, 20 years?
I think unfortunately not. I think the bird, as I mentioned, the cage got very, very tight a few years ago in 2020, 2021. It's expanded a little bit beyond that, but I think there's remarkable continuity in terms of the party's approach to utilizing market reforms, market forces, but never giving up control and continuing to want a strong role for state-owned enterprises in key parts of the economy, and to have the party with an active presence in private companies, regardless of industry, and the ability to actively intervene in parts of the economy and direct resources towards political priorities. And I think all of those are core beliefs of the current leadership. I think they were beliefs of prior leadership in China, and I don't think they're likely to change anytime soon. So depending on where US-China relations go, maybe we'll see a relaxation and the cage will get a little bigger. But to go back to the words of Chen Yun, he says in his quote that there always has to be a cage. And I think China's leadership has been consistent and united on that the economy will always operate within a framework of party and government control.
Nick, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I also want to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who made today's interview possible. We hope that all of you who have tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative, and also that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.